over and over again. When you listen to me speak, you'll hear me emphasize how important it is to practice and to play and have fun. And for me as an illustrator, it's vitally important that I work on practicing all of my skills and not just focusing on one particular aspect of the work I do. I spent a large percentage of my career as a portrait painter, and so doing figures and doing portraits are something I'm very comfortable with, but I'm called on to paint just a myriad of subjects, not the least of which will be subjects which will require some bit of architecture. And so every once in a while, I will stop and just work on familiarizing myself with architectural elements and with working with the laws of perspective. Now, the laws of perspective, it's a world in and of itself, and it can be incredibly complex, but it's also just fun. It's really a fun exercise to get some perspective books and just go over some of the laws that illustrators, comic book artists are very familiar with and that they use on a regular basis. And what I did here for this particular drawing or set of drawings on paper was I've got two old books that are really wonderful. Both of them are by Arthur L. Guptill. And if you're familiar with the publishing house Watson and Guptill, I think both of these men were architects and specialized in teaching, and they created a number of books, and then I think a publishing house came out of it. But Arthur Guptill was, I believe, an architect, like I said, and he has drawing in pencil and then another book, drawing in pen and ink. Both of them I highly recommend. You can get reprints of them, and they're fantastic. But what I really liked about them was that Guptill will spent lots of time working on not just drawing full buildings, but architectural elements. And so for this page of drawings, I decided to sit down and concentrate on closer sections, not just full versions of the buildings, and just to familiarize myself with some architectural elements. To be a good illustrator, you really need to be able to draw. Well, you got to be able to draw out of your imagination. It's just a must. And when you do that, you're not just coming up with things whole cloth. You're not just coming up with things out of nowhere. You're going to usually have a set of images already in your mind. And so if you've got the more images you have already stored like a library in your mind, the more likely you are to be able to come up with interesting imagery. So I'll sit down sometimes and do little buildings, or I'll do just doorways or just windows, something like that, so that people say, well, how do you come up with all these things? Well, I try to have as vast a storehouse of imagery as I can in my mind, so that I've got them to draw from. Now, the media, the tools that I'm using right now, they're colored pencil on toned paper. Now, this is Strathmore's toned tan paper. I think this is a 9x11 or 9x12 probably, and I try to keep those in stock. I've got different sizes. I use them a lot. I don't, I mean, I do draw a lot on white paper, but if I'm doing something like this, I really prefer to work on toned paper. It's, again, another thing you'll hear me emphasize a lot is speed. And to me, speed is of the essence. And so, uh, working on toned paper is really nice because you can use colored paper or a little bit of watercolor or whatever and get all of your mid-tone stuff done, or yeah, all your mid-tone to darks, and then you just use a white pencil or a little bit of white paint, and you can pop some highlights, and it just you don't spend a lot of time trying to do mid-tones. You've got, or that's already set. So now you can just come in and do your darks and your lights, maybe your mid-tone darks and lights, and then you're done. I'm using three different colored pencils, and the reason for that is just some visual interest. That's another reason I don't like working with graphite on white paper, is that things will tend to sort of meld together, and so for me, working with two, three, four different colors, it just helps to separate things out. The colors I'm using, the green is Hooker's green, the blue is Indanthrene blue, and the red, let me see, I'm looking at my pencils here. I think it's red, yes, red violet. And they're all polychromos. I think they're a wax based, or oil based rather. I really like them. They're soft. They're pretty easily erased. Even when you bear down pretty hard, they get real nice, rich darks. And the white that you'll see me using is, in this particular drawing, it's the Caran d'Ache. I also use Derwent and I think another brand that I can't think of in the white. I like a number of brands of colored pencils. I am sort of fond of the polychromos, and I like the Prismacolor a lot. Now, Prismacolor gets bashed right now because they used to have these just incredibly rich, buttery pencils, and a lot of people complain that their quality has gone down. I have not found that to be the case, at least in the pencils that I've ordered and used. I really like their black pencil. Now, I will say they don't seem to erase as quite as easily as the polychromos, but I wouldn't say that's a negative. It's just something to be aware of. But I love all these. Another reason I like colored pencil is that they don't smear. It's really, really hard to smear them, and I find it very annoying to be working and it all of a sudden, my hand has smeared things over. Now, if you can afford it and you want to get Strathmore's mixed media paper, it's really nothing more than their tanned paper. They may make it in gray as well, but it's really nothing more than their tan toned paper, but it's about double in weight. So it's really beefy. It's more of almost like a watercolor board or watercolor paper, and I really like it. It takes water-based mediums real well. So if you're wanting to do watercolor, pen and ink, gouache, or casein on it, or oil or whatever, you can without really hardly any fear of buckling. I've used the toned paper for illustration work, but because I will a lot of times get in with heavy washes, they would start buckling on me and just wouldn't hold the washes as well. That's not a knock or in any way detracting from that paper. It's it's just not designed for as heavy a wash as I would sometimes use. So if you think you might be using fairly fairly heavy washes, I would recommend that you go on and get some of the mixed media paper. It's a fair amount more expensive. It's probably double in price, but it's twice as much paper. It's really robust and thick, so you're getting a good deal, and I've used it a lot for my illustration work. I depend on it quite a bit and just love it. So I would highly recommend Strathmore's mixed media paper. Now you will see that sometimes my hand gets in the way. Sometimes I'll draw left-handed, and I try not to do that when I'm taping because I only have the one camera and my hand will get in the way. But sometimes especially if I'm erasing, I'm always erasing with my left hand. And I consider the eraser as much a drawing tool as the pencil itself, because it's so easy to lift and make these wonderful marks. So if you're new to the game, don't think of your eraser as just a tool for eliminating mistakes. It is very much a drawing tool in and of itself. Now, I forgot to mention that the eraser that I'm using in this is the Faber-Castell Perfection 7058. Now, it's a stick pencil or a stick eraser, pencil eraser. I don't know why it says water-based varnish. That's what it says on the outside of it. If some of you know, you can make in the comments and let me know. I have no idea why it's called that, but they're wonderful little erasers. You can sharpen them with a regular pencil sharpener and use them to get real precise, much more precise than you can with a larger block eraser. So I always encourage you to have a few of those. Now, the one thing, if you're working in colored pencil, to realize is that one sharpener is not going to do it. If you have more than one brand of pencil, I guarantee you that the holes that are designed for whatever sharpener you're using, they're not going to work for more than one brand of pencil. They're all made just a little bit differently, a little bit thicker, a little bit thinner, and they just won't fit in the holes, or they're so big, so small that you break your lid. So just be prepared, if you're going to work with colored pencils, that you're going to have to buy probably one sharpener for each brand of pencil that you have. Now, you'll notice as I was drawing these buildings, especially the pagoda, that I didn't go in and do this really complex grid work. And that was because, for doing the perspective, I just didn't need it. I'm comfortable enough on a lot of this where I can go in and sort of eyeball it. But if you're not, definitely it's worth taking the time to learn exactly how the laws of perspective work, and then do enough where it's sort of committed to your memory and you're not struggling as you're working on more finished pieces. And I picked out things like the pagoda because it's got some interesting perspective going on with those curved lines in the roof, and the fact that the pitch of the roof also kind of goes into the middle tube, or not tube, but the building itself that's sort of stacked like blocks, and it can be confusing. It can kind of throw you off mentally, and you're just, like I said, get a little lost. You're not quite sure where everything's going, and that's where I wanted to do something like the Pagoda, because it was more challenging, just having the perspective in my mind. And always remember, when you're doing something like this, that a good general rule of thumb is what you leave out is as important as what you put in to any drawing or any painting. It's real easy to get caught up in too much detail, and you can wind up, the more you put in, the less you've got. So each new detail is actually detracting from what you were originally trying to say with your piece. And I know some people on the other side is that they're sort of scared of the details, so they leave them out. And that's not what I'm saying. If you are not drawing something because you don't know how and you're scared of it, and that's not good. You need to work on that and get comfortable with it. What I'm talking about is don't put in details just because you see them. Just because you see them and it's not relevant. Yes, it's there, but is it adding to your drawing? Is it making it tell your story better? And remember, that's what you're doing. I don't care what you're drawing. I don't care what you're painting. You're telling a story. Now, it may not be a novel, but you're still telling a story about this little house or this little still life or something. You're trying to convey a message of some sort. And so every detail that you put in, every element that you add, that needs to add to your story. And if you find yourself putting in something and you don't know why, then stop and think about it. Maybe it doesn't need to be there. Also be aware the lighting that's on your photographic reference material, that may not be the lighting, at least if you're in my world, in the illustration world, that may not be the lighting that works with your particular work. So you have to get comfortable looking and using your reference material as a springboard to get things going, but then you're changing the lighting to conform to whatever you need for your particular work of art. In doing that, it's really just a process of realizing that everything can be reduced to 4 basic shapes: a sphere, a cone, a cylinder, and a cube. Everything you see can be reduced to those 4 elements. And it's easier in your mind to think, okay, if I light a cube from one side as opposed to the other, which way are the shadows going to fall? If I light a cylinder from one side, how is the light going to turn on that cylinder, and where is it going to cast its shadow? That's a whole lot easier to wrap your head around than a big complex building or a train or a car or anything that's just got a lot of details in it. So if you can reduce it to that one big element, then you can very easily figure out, oh, okay, well, the light's coming from the upper left, then everything's going to be catching the light in that way, and shadows will be coming and falling on the right hand side. So it's easy to keep things harmonious. Now, you may not be an illustrator, so some of this may not apply to you totally, but even if you're not, unless you just strictly paint plein air and you don't use any other reference material, I guarantee you, you're going to run into a photograph that you want to at least take some elements from, and the lighting is going to be different from what your overall painting or drawing has. So you're going to have to change it. But now, something to keep in mind is that this is sort of thinking in a broad spectrum. Once you start getting into, say, complex architecture where different elements are casting shadows onto inclined planes and other oddly shaped geometric shapes, that gets more complex and you can't figure it out. You actually have to have done enough from life that you can either have it in your head and you know, this is how that cast light, or this is how that shadow would reflected light would bounce around in the shadow. You have to have accumulated, like I talked about earlier, a reservoir of, or not a reservoir, but a library of experiences in your mind that you can draw from, so that it's already in your head. Now, part of the fun of the exercise of this too was page design. It's easy to forget when we're working in our sketchbooks that you don't just go draw something and then just draw it on the page, and then you see something else and just draw it on the page, and you just sort of arbitrarily are throwing images down. Especially if you study a lot of the old masters, it's real interesting how they would carefully design even their sketch pages. They're just beautifully designed, and one element fitting very harmoniously in with another or flowing into another. And so for me, again, a part of the exercise of this was sitting down and going, okay, I put in the cottage. Well, what do I have room for? And all these images are off the internet. I would just sort of scan around until I found something and say, oh, well, that looks cool, I'll draw that. And then all of a sudden, though, you got to sit there and think, well, okay, now how is that going to fit onto this page with the elements already there? And then you find the next element and you think about, well, now what do I want to draw and how's it going to fit in with the other elements? And it was just an organic building process where I would take one element and add it to the next and try and in a beautiful, harmonious way put these all together. Now I'm also including the fonts and the text that I'm adding to the overall design. And that's super important. Again, if you're an illustrator, even if you're not going to be illustrating any text at all, text is going to play a part in your overall design, because you're going to have a page designer, an art director who's going to come in and say, okay, I need an illustration that fits this dimension, and I'm going to have a text wrap, which text wrap is, if you've seen an illustration or a photograph and it's got an odd shape to it, and the text on the book or on the magazine page is literally wrapping around the image, well, that's what's text wrapping. And so you have to be aware that that's a part of the overall design. And I really encourage you to look at poster design. I just love everything from, of course, the great master Alphonse Mucha, all the way to travel posters from the 1930s and 40s, um, 50s, 60s, all of those beautifully done. Theater posters, just amazing. All the wonderful, beautiful fonts that are incorporated very intricately into the design. Um, Theater, yeah, theater and musical posters, those beautiful, and circus posters. I had a friend who, I haven't talked to him in many, many years, but he was a wonderful illustrator and portrait painter, and he had actually been a poster designer for Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus back in the 60s and 70s. He was just a great, great guy, and he would do these massive murals and the posters for them and stuff. So he was, really, really masterful in his abilities with fonts and overall design. So yeah, when you're doing this kind of stuff, don't be afraid to, or don't limit yourself to just one type of artwork. And again, I know not all of you are illustrators, and not everyone that's listening wants to be able to work in 15 different mediums like I do. But even if you're a dedicated watercolorist and that's all you do, and you only do plein air, well, that's okay. But don't be afraid to go and look at some people who do things completely differently. Look at comic book artists, look at poster artists, look at sculptors, look at just anything you can to get some ideas, because there's some fantastic artists out there that you'll learn a lot from, that will surprise you, because they'll be doing something in a medium that, or even with a subject matter that's not something that you're particularly enamored with. But if you can get past the fact that they're drawing something, you may not be into science fiction, you may not care about dragons and damsels and knights and things like that. Well, I mean, that's okay, but don't ignore the imagery that's coming out of that particular field just because the subject matter doesn't appeal to you. Be willing to study their work as well, because you might learn a lot from it. I remember I had a friend, I won't go into detail because I don't want to share any specifics, but I had a friend who, he did not like Norman Rockwell. He thought Norman Rockwell was just sappy and just saccharine, and did not like his work at all. But a great exhibit came through our home gallery museum here in Jackson years ago, and my friend, he went and he saw the Norman Rockwell exhibit, and we talked about it later, and he said, well, I still don't care for Norman Rockwell. I don't like his images or anything like that, but I had no idea what an incredible craftsman he was, that he was just a master painter. And, he said, I learned a lot from going to the exhibit. So, and that, of course, says a lot for my friend, that he was more than willing to go and look at the work, even though he didn't much care for it, and pick up and learn from it. So I would just absolutely encourage you to study anybody and everybody and try to get as much knowledge as you can, because you just never know what you're going to get. Now, I've told people I am not a calligrapher as such. I would love to be. I would love to be that or a scribe. There's a scribe that I follow on YouTube that's just, oh my gosh, what he can do with a calligraphy nib or a paintbrush is just incredible. But I love it, but I don't have the time to go in as in depth as I would like to. But I still try to keep up and study fonts and lettering. And so every once in a while when I do a piece like this, I'll go in and just look for some fun fonts that I can just, again, have in my repertoire, in my head, that if someone called for an illustration, I wouldn't just be totally blank on all the wonderful, rich world of fonts there are out there. I'd have something that I could grab a hold of if I was doing the designing and put in there. So, that's just something I encourage you to pursue. Now, of course, I'm using colored pencil. If you're doing some of these fonts, it'd be a whole lot faster to use some sort of a nib, but I don't have that. I'm not doing a mixed media, so I'm having to do it sort of the very difficult roundabout way of actually drawing each character, and that's certainly very slow, and you don't want to do that if you can avoid it. If you are good enough with the calligraphy pen to actually sit down and just make the marks, then you'll be ahead of the game, because you'll be a whole lot faster. Now, we'll say the colors that I'm using, the red, the sort of maroon, the green, and the blue, I just have those pencils. At some point, I'll come in and I'll change the colors and use a different green or a purple instead of a maroon, or maybe a yellow, but yellow's probably kind of too light to be seen. Maybe some of the earth tones, so I'm not wed to those colors. I will say I just saw, as I was working, that I pulled up a Jelly Roll pen and was using that for some of this as well. And I like the Jelly Roll pens. Now, I have a little bit of mixed experience with them. They're not as, I just don't seem to be able to make them work as well as some people do. Some people can just jump in and they're fantastic with them. I have a little bit more issues. Sometimes they don't put down the ink like I want them to, and they don't adhere like I want them to. But other times they're fantastic. So, and when they are, they're indispensable. So I very much encourage you, maybe get a Jelly Roll as well. And at the very end, I put in just sort of a design element, just some sort of a little flourish thing, like a paisley. And you'll see I kind of mess around with it until I get it the way I wanted to. And I just felt like it needed something over in that corner, and I didn't want to put anything really highly detailed, just some little design, just a flourish, just for fun. Well, I think that kind of wraps that up. I'll let you go, and I'm glad you watched, and I hope you learned something. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Arthropologist, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more episodes like this, think about subscribing. I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm The Arthropologist.